things that, a wisdom is that we all do that which terrifies us. The challenge comes from that which terrifies us. I don't know if I can apply that universally, but in my case, it was kind of true. Now, I gave that talk on the Zulu Nation at the assembly. I was 4 years at that point off the ship as a refugee, political refugee of any kind. They used to call them DPs, displaced person, in that era. In 1948, in March, we landed at the foot of Market Street in San Francisco. And we had been in Japan. I was born in Japan in 1937. My parents had first, the movie will cover some of this. But I grew up in Japan, and my parents got, the war. They were idealistic, they were bohemians. They went there they left everything behind, and they just wanted to. My father was fascinated by Oriental culture and Oriental languages. He had been declared a non-Aryan, couldn't continue in Berlin studying. So they went to Japan. And in those days, you couldn't take any money out. And so they had enough money for 3 months. You could smuggle, you could do all sorts of things, but that was not my father's way. And then he worked, but they wanted to get out after 2 years when they realized when Japan attacked China, my father knew he was in the wrong country. He left Germany because he was sure Germany was going to do that sort of thing, and somehow he had never imagined a Zen, a Buddhist, he had this imagination in the 30s of what the times were like and Japan was like. But then they got trapped, they couldn't get out, they never could get a visa. It was only after I went to Canada as an immigrant and so on, it was only after they died, and this is not in the film so I can say it, I got a whole sheaf of correspondence, and from 1937, the year of my birth, they were trying to get into Canada. Bless that country, Canada would never take them. And then in 41, it got too late. They also tried America. America wouldn't take them. And in 45, 46, 47, they began again, but now they had 4 kids. Canada still wouldn't take them. But God bless America. America, somehow they got a visa, and we managed to immigrate, to leave. My parents wanted a new opportunity for their children, and also my father wanted to study again, and he'd met all these interesting officers and everything in his job when the Americans arrived. And so we began, a new journey in America. I went to Canada in 1966 with my wife. I had no idea. And when I became a Canadian citizen a few years later, I said that to my father, and I love Canada, but I will say this anyway. He said, his only comment to me was, Canada has no moral backbone. Now, at the time, I just thought this was odd. My father was a little odd, as all fathers maybe are. And I didn't think about it. It was only after they died and I saw the correspondence that they've been trying to get into Canada for 10 years or something like that from Japan. They wanted to join very good friends in Canada from Germany, And anyway, so when I came to Putney, I'd already been through a war. When the Americans, we had a hard time. It was wartime. And we were on the edge of the German community. We were not in the German community. There was a very active German community in Japan. It was also very Nazi. And my parents weren't Nazis. And so it was a tough time for them. When the Americans arrived, I worked for them as an interpreter. I knew English, and of course I knew Japanese. I was fluent in Japanese at that time, and I worked at the gate with the military police. There were lots of Japanese workers going into the American base that was set up near us. And one little experience I had, the only one I remember, is at the gate, some Japanese worker, under his cap, the military police found a little electrical plug under the cap. And then I had to translate, between the military police and that worker. And I don't know what happened, But anyway, I always like to think that the Japanese electronic industry began with that little electrical plug that the Japanese worker was taking out of the base. I mean, don't underestimate the people that you conquer, you know, and they always learn from you. Anyway, I had all that behind me, and so here I come to Putney 4 years later. I still spoke Japanese, but nobody, I don't think I ever spoke at that time about my past, my years in Japan. And I mean, Putney for me was an oasis. Nobody asked. I forgot my Japanese while I was here at Putney. I managed my German by going out in the woods here and talking to trees. That's one thing I couldn't lose, was my German. But I had conversations with trees. It worked quite well. As a language technique, you might try it. So, you know, the odd thing is I give a talk on the Zulus, whom I didn't know in any way, except, and then we'll get to the film, except that I discovered 5 years or so ago that an uncle, my father's younger brother, had gone to Africa to get out of Germany in 1938. And he'd had it turns out, I only learned this, you know, he had a love affair, if you want to, you know, with a Zulu woman in Africa in apartheid times, and the Zulu family would not, and a child. He had the child in his arm only for one day, and the Zulu family would not allow a marriage, and of course it was apartheid. So that, you know, but he supported that family. I discovered all this later because we met his son 5 years ago. So there's an African Paasche. And when I heard about his childhood, I told him he had the best childhood of all of us because he was raised by this vast Zulu family, and who considered him, by the way, white. And of course the Afrikaners considered him black, so he had an interesting kind of situation. Anyway, so of course when I gave this talk here about the Zulus, I didn't know that I in fact would have a Zulu cousin who now lives in London, whom we've gotten to know. Okay, I just wanted to give you this little bit to get the film going so that you see that there's a grounding here in my life at Putney and in my life for this film, and we'll have a little time to discuss it afterwards. But I don't want to, you know, when I said Putney was an oasis for me, the thing I liked initially best at Putney was being forced, in those times we were forced to eat 3 square meals a day, and I'd never had that in my life, so I thought Putney was absolutely terrific. Okay. Let's have the film. I won't say any more. It speaks for itself, but afterwards you can please you know, ask questions and maybe I'll say a few words.